In Hollywood, every light hides a shadow. Every applause has a silence behind it. This is the story of those who lived between the two. Welcome to Hollywood Biographies, Los Angeles, 1994. On the set of Death Wish 5, the yellow studio lights cast a dim glow across the face of a man who had spent more than half a century on the silver screen. Charles Bronson sat silently before the makeup mirror, his deep eyes seeming to look straight through himself. No lines, no expression. Only the raspy breathing of someone long accustomed to living in silence. The makeup artist asked softly, "Are you tired, Charlie?" He smiled, said nothing. All his life he had chosen silence. Not out of pride, but because it was the only way to preserve the truest part of himself in a world that never stopped making noise. In that light, he was no longer an actor nor a symbol. He was simply a man looking back on his life, a life forged by loneliness and endurance. People called him the man of steel, the embodiment of strength, justice, and the belief in vengeance. But had anyone ever asked what makes a person so hardened that they no longer feel pain? While the world celebrated his toughness, did anyone wonder where that strength was forged and what it cost? On screen, he was always the man with a gun. Off screen, he was the man who avoided the camera. Between those two images lay more than art. It was the chasm of a soul once crushed by poverty, loss, and the fear of being forgotten. People saw the strong man, but few ever saw the child who once hid his tears beneath layers of black coal dust. Charles Bronson slowly closed his eyes. In that moment, every sound vanished. Only light and shadow remained, merging like two halves of a single life. And in that silence, one question surfaced. The question he had never been able to answer. Can a man learn to be silent out of strength, or simply because there's nothing left to say? Before he became the man of steel, Charles Bronson was once a boy of the dark, where the first light he ever saw did not come from the sky, but from a faint lamp deep within the coal mines. In 1921, in the small town of Ehrenfeld, nestled among the mountains of Pennsylvania, where the air was thick with the smell of coal, a child was born in a shabby wooden house, its walls blackened by smoke. He was named Charles Dennis Bukinski, the 11th of 15 children born to Lithuanian immigrant parents. In that little house filled with dust and nothing else, poverty hung in every breath. His father, a coal miner, left for work before dawn and returned after sunset, his face covered in soot. His mother quietly washed, sewed, and fed her children with cracked, work-worn hands. In that world, the sound of his father's cough and the metallic clank of shovels in the mine were the first lullabies Charles ever knew. When he was 10, his father died, his lungs destroyed by a lifetime of coal dust. On the day of the funeral, Charles stood still, clutching his mother's coat, not crying, just watching the wooden coffin being carried down the blackened slope. That death didn't just take away his father, it forced Charles to become a man. Soon after, he quit school and entered the mine, a place people said even sunlight feared to reach. His first job was to shovel coal scraps and push ore carts out of the tunnel. The cart weighed several times more than his frail body. One day, it slipped down the slope and collapsed over him. The miners thought he was dead. Moments later, the boy crawled out, his face black with coal dust, smiling faintly. "It's okay. I'm used to it." The men, twice his size, fell silent. From then on, they called him Little Charlie the Tough. The name stuck like destiny, But poverty didn't stay in the mines. It followed him into the classroom, where other children looked down on kids like him. On his first day of school, his mother, too poor to buy new clothes, cut and stitched one of his sister's old skirts into a pair of pants. When Charles walked into class, the children burst out laughing. One shouted, "Hey, look! The boy's wearing a dress!" He stood still, head down, fists clenched until they bled. No fight, no words. But something inside him cracked that day. A small piece of pride crushed forever. From then on, he chose silence. Years later, when he had become a star, he still spoke of that day as an unhealed scar. "I learned that if you can't make them respect you, make them quiet," he once said in a rare interview. For that boy, school wasn't a place to learn. It was a place to feel out of place. Charles didn't speak English. At home, his family spoke only Lithuanian. When the teacher called his name, he didn't answer. She thought he was mute. A classmate translated, and the class erupted in laughter again. He didn't understand their words, but he knew exactly who they were laughing at. From that day, Charles barely spoke for months. He learned through his eyes, through silence, by observing how people stood, how they hid their fear. That habit later became his greatest weapon. He acted with his eyes, not his words. Those years passed in a grim rhythm. Mornings in the mine, nights at home, then mornings again. By 12, his hands were calloused like a grown man's. People said, this boy was born to work. But after every shift, Charles would climb onto the roof and sit quietly, watching the moon drift through the dusty clouds. The moonlight was pale and dim, yet to him, it was the only thing that felt pure. Many years later, when asked what he remembered most from his childhood, he said simply, "I remember the moon. It was beautiful, but it wasn't for me. It only reminded me that light still existed, even if I couldn't touch it." The darkness of the mines didn't just steal his childhood. It taught him what real strength was. Not power, not fame, but the ability to stand firm when no one stands beside you. In a world where men died from coal dust, where children learned endurance before they learned to dream, that boy discovered life's first lesson. If you want to survive, be strong. If you want to keep your pride, be silent. Years later, when Hollywood hailed him as the Man of Steel, few knew that steel had been forged in those very years. From coal dust, hunger, humiliation, and the loneliness of a child who didn't understand the language around him. Every scar, every wrinkle, every quiet frown on screen came from one place: the mines of Ehrenfeld. That night, the boy named Charles sat once again on the porch, hands black with coal, eyes lifted to the moon. In that faint light, he saw his own reflection, small, stubborn, and unbreakable. He didn't know what the world beyond the hills looked like. He only knew one thing: someday, he would no longer live in the dark. When you have nothing, silence is the only way to keep your pride. And in that silence, Charles Bronson found the first truth that would define his life: the strength of a man who was never allowed to be weak. At 16 or 17, while other boys were still dreaming of the future, Charles Bronson already knew the taste of earth, sweat, and despair. He worked 10 hours a day underground, in a darkness so dense it never lifted. The sound of pickaxes striking stone echoed like the heartbeat of the miners. Heavy, weary, but never stopping. At the age when others learned how to love, Charles learned how to endure. He didn't talk much. He just kept his head down, hands calloused, eyes accustomed to the dark. Every time he looked up, he told himself that perhaps light was meant for other people. Then the war came, and for the first time in his life, Charles saw a way out, not from poverty, but from the mines. In 1943, he enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, serving as a tail gunner on a B-29 bomber. When asked why he chose that position, he simply said, "I'm already used to living in the dark." There, alone in the tail of the aircraft, no one spoke. The roar of the engines drowned out every other sound. Once again, he was surrounded by darkness, but this time it smelled not of coal, but of gasoline, gunpowder, and fear. Charles never fought directly on the front lines, but every takeoff was a dance with death. He watched his crewmates leave and never return, saw young faces vanish into silence. Each night, after landing, he would sit quietly in the cockpit, listening to the metal cool and creak, a sound eerily similar to the furnaces dying down in the mines. It was a strange repetition of fate, only now the sky had become another kind of underground. In the military, Charles didn't stand out. He wasn't charming, didn't joke, didn't tell stories. But when others panicked, he stayed calm. His discipline and silence earned both respect and distance. A man who served with him once recalled, "He spoke so little we forgot what his voice even sounded like. But there was something in his eyes that made you think twice before joking with him." Charles never needed to prove his strength. His silence was enough. The war taught him lessons the mines never had, about the futility of noise, the cost of survival, and how close a man could come to death and still remain silent. When the war ended, he didn't celebrate or cheer like the others. He stood by the airfield staring at the blackened wrecks of burned planes. The smell of smoke mixed with the memory of coal dust, a hauntingly familiar scent. He realized he had just left one darkness, only to step into another, broader, emptier, quieter. But amid the ashes, there was one small moment that changed his life. On his last night with the unit, Charles was assigned to clean the cockpit. When the searchlight shone across the curved glass, it reflected his face, dark, hardened, unrecognizable from the 10-year-old boy he once was. In that instant, he realized something. Perhaps he wasn't born to live in darkness forever. Maybe somehow, there was another kind of light, one not from the sun, but from human resilience itself. When he left the service, Charles carried with him two things: a pair of hands hardened by labor, and eyes that had seen too much fear. From the mines to the sky, from coal dust to gun smoke, both worlds shared the same silence. Yet they were two different kinds, one born of poverty, the other of death. Together, they forged within him a soul of steel, steady, solemn, and unbreakable. In the stillness after the war, he returned to the land, unsure where to go or what to do. But for the first time, a faint light flickered in his mind, fragile, yet real. Like the moon he once watched from the mine's rooftop, it wasn't bright, but it was enough to guide a man out of the dark. And that was the moment Charles Bronson began to dream of another life, one no longer buried underground, but lived where light was always ahead. When the war ended, America was filled with the sounds of parades and laughter, but inside Charles Bronson, there was only silence. The young soldier returned with calloused hands, a sunburned face, and eyes that had long since learned to live in the dark. He had nothing but memories, the drone of bombers, the friends who never came back, and the fear that still lingered, trapped somewhere in his mind. After months of drifting, he arrived in California. The land people said where, if you had a dream, the light would find you. But light doesn't find everyone. At first, Bronson found work as a backstage laborer at the Pasadena Playhouse, a small theater for art students. He didn't know how to act, nor did he dare to speak in front of people. One night, as the stage lights came on, the old director saw him standing in the shadows, a solid frame, a weathered face, eyes quiet, yet intense. "Hey, you there," the man called. "Come here, try standing in the light." And Bronson stepped forward. In that moment, the room went silent, not because he said anything, but because he didn't. He just stood there, motionless, as if his whole life had led to that single second. The light reflected off a face once covered in coal dust, off eyes that had seen death, and suddenly someone realized this man didn't need to learn acting. He was acting. The way he stood, the way he stayed silent, that was the story. It was something so raw, so true, no one could imitate it. Within months, he began studying at Pasadena Playhouse. He never acted like a special student. He arrived early, stayed late, quietly observing others, taking careful notes on every gesture. While the younger students dreamed of fame, Bronson kept staring at the ceiling lights, as if still not used to being seen. Then came a new kind of obstacle: politics. America was in the grip of anti-communist fear, and his surname, Buczynski, sounded too Eastern European. Directors hesitated. A friend advised, "Change your name, Charlie. They won't hire you if they think you're Soviet." He said nothing. A few days later, he passed the gates of Paramount Studios, saw the sign reading Bronson Gate, and from that moment, Charles Bronson was born. A new name, short, strong, metallic, just like him. In the 1950s, Bronson began landing small parts. A criminal in House of Wax, 1953. A silent thief in Machine Gun Kelly, 1958. Directors loved his presence. He doesn't need dialogue. He makes the audience understand just by looking. In an industry where everyone tried to be loved, Bronson did the opposite. He made people respect him. A rugged face, cold eyes, a gravelly voice that sounded cut from steel. All of it made him unforgettable, even when he appeared for only seconds on screen. Then, in 1960, came his first big opportunity, The Magnificent Seven. A film packed with stars like Yul Brynner, Steve McQueen, and James Coburn, men Hollywood had already anointed as icons of masculinity. Among them, Charles Bronson was merely the seventh man. A minor role, few lines, barely noticed. And yet, every time he appeared, the whole frame seemed to pause. One day on set in Mexico, the famous actors argued over who should stand at the center of the shot. Bronson stayed silent, shoveling dirt to help the crew set up the scene. Director John Sturges approached him. "Aren't you afraid you'll be out of frame?" He answered softly, like a breath. "I don't need to be in the middle. I just need my character to be real." In the film's final scene, the village children ask his character, Bernardo, why he chose to fight for them. Bronson looks down and says slowly, "Because you remind me of myself when I was young." No one on set breathed. The director later recalled, he wasn't reading a line, he was speaking to his own childhood. From that moment, audiences around the world began to know the name Charles Bronson. The man who didn't speak much, didn't smile much, but made people believe with a single look. It was the first time real light shone on him, and he no longer turned away. 3 years later came The Great Escape, 1963, where Bronson played Danny the Tunnel King, the prisoner who dug tunnels to escape the Nazis. It was a fateful role, for in real life, Bronson suffered from claustrophobia, a scar left by his years in the coal mines. During the tunnel scenes, he began shaking, sweating, gasping for breath. Director Sturgis, worried, offered to stop the shoot, but Bronson growled, "No, I dug coal underground for real. If I survive that, I'll survive this." Later, after finishing a scene, he sat outside for hours, silent. When a co-star asked if he was all right, he simply said, "I just dug up my childhood." The set fell silent. Everyone realized that for him, this wasn't just acting, it was therapy, a way to confront the fear that had followed him all his life. That tunnel scene became legendary. No music, no dialogue, only Bronson's breathing, raw, rapid, heavy, made viewers feel buried with him. The director left the sound untouched. "I wanted the audience to hear the breath of a real man," Sturgis said, and they did. The Great Escape became a sensation. Charles Bronson, once deemed too rough to be a star, became the symbol of quiet strength. He didn't smile on red carpets, didn't make long speeches, didn't mingle with the press, but everyone understood the era of Charles Bronson had begun. Fame came late, but when it did, it blazed like a harsh light. Studios came calling. 6-figure checks were signed under the name Charles Bronson. From a poor miner, he had become one of Hollywood's most sought-after faces. At 40, he walked the red carpet, flashes exploding around him, photographers jostling just to capture that face. The face of endurance, but few knew the truth. Bronson hated ceremonies, hated the lights, hated the noise. Standing in the middle of Hollywood's glitter, he still carried the silence of the mines. In a rare interview, when asked if he felt happy, he said quietly, "The more famous I get, the more I feel I'm still in the mine." The only difference is that now, Hollywood lights replaced the oil lamps. People thought the light had saved him, but the truth was, it only illuminated his old wounds more clearly. The boy from the coal pit was still inside him, only now he was standing before millions, unable to turn away. And as all the lights shone on Charles Bronson, he still looked down, his eyes unchanged, deep, solemn, alone. The light grew brighter, and the price had only just begun. In the dazzling light of The Great Escape, Charles Bronson entered one of the strangest chapters of his life, a time when fame began to shine on him, even as his heart drifted toward a dangerous flame. In 1963, during the filming of the movie, he met Jill Ireland, a British actress with bright eyes and a smile that seemed to melt the cold around him. But at the time, Jill was married to his co-star David McCallum, who had acted alongside him in that very same film. No one knows exactly when it began. All that's known is that between the two, there existed a peculiar silence. Not explosive, not rushed, but certain. McCallum once recalled, "Bronson looked at Jill and said to me, 'I'm going to marry her.' It sounded like a joke, but a few years later it became true. In 1968, Jill divorced McCallum. That same year, she and Bronson married, amid waves of gossip. Hollywood was shaken. The press called it the most scandalous affair of the decade. But amid all the noise, the two lived quietly, as if they already knew their love could only breathe in silence. For over 2 decades, they acted together in more than 10 films, from Rider on the Rain 1970, to Love and Bullets, 1979, Jill became his most frequent co-star, the only person who could make Bronson smile once the cameras stopped. Amid the glitter of Hollywood, they lived in an isolated Bel Air home, raising children, planting trees, rarely socializing. People joked, "No one wants to act with him except his wife." Bronson didn't care. He once said, "I don't need anyone else. She understands me without asking." The 1970s marked both the greatest breakthrough of his career and the fiercest storm of his life. In 1974, Death Wish premiered. His role as Paul Kersey, a man who loses his wife and daughter in a brutal attack and becomes a vigilante, propelled Bronson to unprecedented fame. He was no longer Hollywood's quiet, tough guy. He became an icon of strength, of vengeance, of justice through a gun. The world cheered him. Theaters sold out. His name appeared on magazine covers across continents. In Japan, his face adorned razor boxes, the symbol of real manhood. Across Europe, he was celebrated as the silent hero. But in America, a different storm rose. Critics and journalists condemned Death Wish as a glorification of violence, a hymn to vigilante justice. Some labeled him the face of America's fear. Bronson didn't argue. When a reporter asked if he thought he was promoting violence, he simply said, "I just play a man who's lost everything. When you lose everything, you stop having choices." Behind that short answer lay a deep conflict. Because deep down, Bronson despised the very image the world celebrated. He had once been the humiliated boy, the silent soldier, the miner who only wanted to survive. And now, Hollywood forced him to become the Man of Steel, a mask he knew was false. They wanted him to hold a gun, to kill coldly, to embody absolute masculinity, while he, all his life, feared only one thing: being trapped, trapped underground, trapped in roles, and now, trapped in his own image. The more famous he became, the more suffocated he felt. His later films, Death Wish 2, 3, Fort, circled the same character, the same rage, the same gun. He no longer needed dialogue, but he also no longer felt alive. Jill understood better than anyone. In one interview, she said, "Charles is the gentlest man I've ever known. But Hollywood doesn't believe that. They only believe in his cold face." She became his refuge. When the world saw a hero, she saw a frightened man. When the world celebrated steel, she saw the softness he hid. They aged together through the noise, crossing film sets, applause, and criticism. And while the screen called him the Avenger, Jill still called him simply Charlie. By the late 1980s, as the action genre began to fade, the Death Wish series grew long and weary. It brought him wealth and fame, but also took something vital away. He began to withdraw from the public eye, laughed less, spoke less, and in the deepening eyes of a 60-year-old man, something had changed. As if the light he once reached for was now burning him from within. People still saw him at film premieres, holding Jill's hand tightly. They smiled, standing together, calm amid the flashes and questions. But on nights when no one was watching, he sat alone, drinking quietly, staring at the empty yard. When Jill asked, he said, "I'm afraid. Not because they hate me, but because they believe I'm something I'm not." The price of light isn't material loss. It's when the world believes only in your strongest version, and you can no longer be weak. Through all those years, the roles, the image, the solitude, Jill remained the one who kept his humanity intact. She taught him to play music, to sculpt, to laugh when he ruined a clay statue, She called it the art of silence, the only thing Bronson didn't have to act. He once said, "People think I'm made of steel, but Jill knows I'm just made of earth, the kind that's been pressed too long." Outside, the media still called him the man of steel. But inside, Charles Bronson was only a man learning how to breathe. In the blinding light of fame, he became the symbol of a masculinity he never believed in. And in the quiet shadow behind that glare, there still burned a small, fragile flame, a flame named Jill Ireland. May 1990. In their small Bel Air home, Charles Bronson sat beside the hospital bed, holding tightly the hand of the woman who had walked with him through more than 20 years of life. Jill Ireland, his friend, his wife, the only person who had ever seen the tenderness inside him, was taking her final breaths. The room was thick with the smell of medicine, the cold white light reflecting off her thinning face. She looked at him, smiled faintly, and whispered, "Don't cry, Charlie. Open some wine and smile." And then she was gone, quietly, the same way she had lived beside him. The news of Jill Ireland's death from metastatic cancer stunned Hollywood. But for Bronson, it was as if the world collapsed. The man who had played Avengers and killers, who had stared down 1,000 on-screen deaths, now couldn't stand beneath the weight of one real loss. Neighbors said he didn't leave the house for weeks. The only sign of life came from the studio in the garden, where a faint light burned late into the night. Inside, he sat motionless before a canvas, his eyes empty, as if his soul had been taken away. All his life he had fought against the world, against poverty, against darkness, against the fear of being trapped. But now he understood. No role, no gun, no act of vengeance could fight the emptiness of a broken heart. Bronson began to paint and sculpt, and for the first time in decades, he signed his old name, Buczynski. Not to hide who he was, but to return to the boy he had once been. The child sitting on a porch, hands black with coal, staring at the moon. In his small studio, he molded clay figures, faces without names, eyes forever closed. When someone asked who they were, he replied, "They're the ones I couldn't keep." Loss had turned him into someone else, half as young, but twice as self-aware. On film sets, he spoke less, and in eyes once filled with fire, there was now only gentle fatigue. When asked why he no longer made action films, he smiled hoarsely and said, "I've fought enough." And he meant it. Through the 1990s, Bronson drifted away from the spotlight. He spent his time with his children, lived simply, rarely appeared in public. Friends said that every morning he'd sit alone with his coffee, watching sunlight spill through the window, sometimes smiling, the same smile Jill had loved. Some days, he'd open a bottle of wine, pour a glass, and set it beside her photo. He didn't cry. He just sat there, silent. In one rare interview, when asked if he regretted anything, Bronson gazed into the distance and said, "I used to think strength would protect me, but in the end, the only thing that helps you stand is love." His silence then no longer felt heavy. It wasn't a shield anymore. It was peace. As if, after years of fighting, he had finally understood that sometimes the greatest strength lies in accepting loss. By the late 1990s, Charles Bronson kept painting. His works, minimalist, solitary, bore the forgotten signature Buczynski. Each brushstroke seemed like a message to himself. Light and darkness are not opposites. They are two halves of the same life. And sometimes, when someone mentioned Jill, he would smile softly and say, "She never really left. I just learned how to live in her silence." From the man who once made the world tremble, Charles Bronson entered old age with the stillness of someone who had finally grasped the meaning of loss. In that small room, surrounded by unfinished statues, sunlight filtered through the window, touching his thin, veined hands. For the first time in his life, he no longer tried to be strong. He simply sat there, quiet, and smiled. Because in the end, violence had never saved him from pain, but love had taught him how to live with it. And as the sun sank low in that dim golden light, the man once called steel finally returned to earth, soft, real, and whole. In the final years of the 1990s, the man who had once made the world tremble quietly stepped into the background of his own life. After nearly a decade spent in the loneliness of loss, Charles Bronson met Kim Weeks, a woman much younger than him, once an assistant to Jill Ireland. She entered his life gently, without noise, without lights. In 1998, they married in a small ceremony attended only by a few close relatives. No cameras, no red carpets, just two souls who had weathered enough storms, sitting together in silence. After so many years of chaos, he finally found a moment of peace. But peace came late. Alzheimer's disease began to creep in, blurring the memories of a man who once remembered every scar of his life. The actor who had embodied dozens of characters, who had memorized every look and line, now forgot his own name, forgot why the woman beside him held his hand each morning. Those who knew him said that at times, he no longer remembered being Charles Bronson, the symbol of strength and endurance. He was just an old man, sitting in the garden, watching sunlight filter through the leaves, murmuring fragments of dialogue from another life. The illness took his memories, but it could not take his essence. Though his body weakened, a faint light still flickered in his clouded eyes. That same old light, not bright, but steady, like the fire that once burned deep in a coal mine. The man once made of steel had turned soft as ash, but ash too is what remains of fire. One day, his daughter Zuleika said through tears, "My father lived like a miner in every role he played. He always dug deep until he found the truth. And perhaps that was how he lived his entire life. Digging into the earth, into darkness, into the depths of his own soul, searching for something real in a world full of illusions." On August 30th, 2003, Charles Bronson passed away in Los Angeles at the age of 81. No grand funeral, no speeches, just a soft, sunny day. His family placed on the altar a small clay statue, one he had sculpted himself, signed with the name Bukinski. Beside it sat a glass of red wine and a note, written in shaky handwriting, for Jill. In his final moment, the man who had embodied strength slipped away in absolute silence. No lights, no audience. Only the slow breathing of someone who had finally found rest. People called him the man of steel, but perhaps he was never made of steel in the way the world believed. Because true strength in steel doesn't lie in its hardness. It lies in its ability to withstand heat. The more fire it endures, the stronger it becomes. And Bronson, throughout his life, endured every flame of war, of fame, of love, of loss. Now, in the quiet, he had finally found what he'd been searching for all along, a peace that needed no performance. Outside, sunlight still poured over Los Angeles, the city that had made him and taken so much from him. And within that light, one could still almost see him, a quiet man walking away, his face dusted with ash, yet his eyes still shining. As if, somewhere out there, Charles Bronson was still digging, not to escape the darkness this time, but to find his way back to himself. The life of Charles Bronson was a perfect circle, beginning in the darkness of a coal mine and ending in the gentle light of peace. From a fatherless boy in Pennsylvania, his hands covered in coal dust, to a man Hollywood would one day revere, he had walked through every layer of human pain to uncover the true meaning of strength. No formal training, no star looks, no powerful connections, only willpower and silence. Bronson entered Hollywood with the hands of a miner, but he left it with the legacy of a legend. Across more than 100 films, he became not just an actor, but the embodiment of a kind of man the world rarely sees anymore. Few words, honest, enduring, and principled. From The Magnificent Seven, 1960, The Great Escape, 1963, to Once Upon a Time in the West, 1968, and the Death Wish series, 1974-1994, Bronson redefined the archetype of Hollywood's silent hero. At the height of his career, he was once the highest-paid actor in the world, earning $12 million per year, an extraordinary figure in the 1970s. When Death Wish premiered in 1974, the film grossed over $22 million, nearly 10 times its budget, becoming the definitive symbol of the vigilante action genre. The series would span 2 decades and 5 installments, turning Charles Bronson into a global brand. In Europe, he was called the most respected American, while in Japan, his image appeared on billboards, razor boxes, and magazines, a symbol of the man who doesn't need to speak to be believed. Cinema remembers him as the face of personal justice, but those who truly knew him understood. Bronson never believed in violence. He only knew one truth, that sometimes silence is the only way to survive. And that's why audiences loved him. Not for the bullets, but for the sorrow in his eyes, for the loneliness behind the iron mask. Off-screen, Charles Bronson was entirely different. He loved painting, sculpting, and collecting antiques. His artworks, signed under his birth name Buczynski, are still displayed in private collections around the world. He valued labor deeply. Even as a millionaire, he repaired his own fences, tended his garden, and once said, "I never forget the smell of coal. It reminds me that light always begins in darkness." When he passed away in 2003 at the age of 81, Bronson left behind an estimated $75 million in assets, houses, land, and film royalties. But his true legacy was not material. It was the spiritual one, a symbol of integrity and resilience. Filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino, Christopher Nolan, and Nicholas Winding Refn have all cited him as an influence. A man who could tell a story without words. Not every man of steel is unfeeling. Some choose silence, simply so they don't break. And that is the truest light Charles Bronson left behind. The light of quiet strength, of a man who walked through darkness not to conquer it, but to find himself within it. A light not dazzling, but steady, like the coal that burns deep underground, glowing softly for a lifetime. If you've ever had to pretend to be strong just to survive, leave a heart for the man who lived by silence. Charles Bronson. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more cinematic journeys into the lives behind the fame. This is Hollywood Biographies, the light, the silence, the legacy.